Are you having your players travel across your world, but you're not allowing the environment to impact their journey? Well, let's fix that. Let's get to it.
Welcome to Dungeon Brew.
Welcome back, everyone, to Dungeon Brew. We are continuing our series on collaborative storytelling, and today we're going to be talking about how we use environments in that process. I think as game masters, we oftentimes think of an environment as like a backdrop for our setting, so we kind of explain what it is, but we don't really have it impact the game. And it should be a tool that we are utilizing. It should be influencing our gameplay, it should be presenting challenges to the players around the table, and it should even react to player decisions. So in the end, I like to think of my world as a living, breathing organism, kind of like that concept of Mother Earth, so that whether I'm looking at this windswept tundra or a city on the brink of war or an ancient jungle that's teeming with lost ruins, I want the setting itself to feel alive for the players, where it's responding to what's happening to the players and it's impacting them based on its natural elements. Alright, so we have lots of examples of environments in our natural world, and we kind of take them for granted instead of really analyzing what an environment does. So I want to start off this video by talking about what makes a good environment. And this is, I think, a great way to approach environments in your TTRPG, is making sure that it accomplishes these three things. One, it should shape how the players are interacting with the world, and we're going to talk about that more in a moment. It should also create obstacles that force creative problem solving for your characters. And three, it should reinforce the mood or the atmosphere of your game. So the example that I kind of jotted down for you guys is thinking about a cursed swamp. A cursed swamp should feel kind of spooky, right? So there's a couple of ways that you can accomplish this. Maybe you can force your characters to slow down with their movement, so they move at half speed when they go through the swamp, and you give the sense that there's something dangerous lurking within the swamp. So sometimes I might even have characters roll perception checks even when there's nothing to be found, because it gives them this idea that something's watching them or something's lurking or there's something they should be looking for, even though there's really nothing that I have planned to jump out of the waters. So stepping into the swamp, with a bit of nudging, can really change the way that players approach exploration within that environment. If they ignore my prompts and they just kind of charge into that environment unprepared, then I might have some contingencies where they get lost or they get stuck in quicksand or they're bitten by something nasty. So there's some sort of result for rushing forward in this place that I want them to be tiptoeing slowly and cautiously because it's supposed to feel spooky. Your environment should always be something that players have to consider and not just ignore or just think that it kind of exists there, but they don't really have to adjust the way that they're approaching it. It should always change the way that they approach the game. I am now going to go through some of the key elements of an environment for what makes it a strong environment. But as I do, I want you to try to apply these three things: the shaping how players interact, creating obstacles that force creative problem solving, and reinforcing the mood, to determine how this can really reinforce the gaming experience with yourself and the players around the table. I'm going to give you some examples, but feel free to fill in the blanks. The first key element we're going to discuss is geography and terrain. The landscape obviously should actively affect your gameplay. So let's say that you have it in the mountains. In the mountains, you're going to likely have slower travel. There could be the potential for some dangerous falls or rock slides, and you would have some limited visibility that might impact the perception checks of the players. Moving on, you may have a forest landscape. In these environments, there is the potentiality for ambushes to be more successful, meaning that your players have a higher DC save in order to determine when or where that may occur. You may also have the case where navigation is trickier. John had us run a campaign once in a forest and we kept getting lost, and we were having a real trouble managing our rations because we were stuck in the forest for so long. Or you may have the potentiality of having more poisonous plants or fungi and not having the antidotes to respond to them. Another environment you may consider are the deserts, which I like this particular environment because it allows me to use exhaustion levels with my players, because they may be having issues with the heat and they're just becoming drained from the sun beating down on them all the time. You could also force some water rationing in order to survive in this environment. And of course, don't forget the potentiality of a sandstorm, which can bring its own hazards. And the other example I wanted to provide are marshlands, which again, this can provide slow movement for your players to move through this space, but you can also have it cause additional hazards, like maybe trapping the cart or even introducing disease to the players. And again, they may have to use some of their spell resources in order to get rid of those diseases. Bottom line, if your players can walk through an environment without it changing their approach, you're missing an opportunity. The next key element we're going to discuss are seasons, and while this may seem fairly intuitive, I am surprised at how many folks don't approach seasons well in their tabletop role-playing game. They're not just a time change, they really shift how the world works and how people respond around them. In fact, I take an unhealthy amount of time deciding what season I want to start a lot of my campaigns. So for instance, if you start your campaign in the spring, this is about new growth, but along with that you're going to see maybe rivers that are swollen with water that are flooding the banks and impacting the town and shifting migration of different animals that live along the river. You might also have unpredictable storms that can have a real impact on the players. If you're looking at the summer, we're talking again about brutal heat and droughts and fires. You have insects that are swarming around, and maybe you have some dangerous insects that are swarming around that are a real threat to people that are traveling across the wilds. If you're looking at autumn, I love having harvest festivals during my autumn, bringing out cultural events, looking at what an early frost may do to the crops or to the people or folks that haven't properly prepared for an early cold season. And again, looking at those migrating creatures. Is this bringing wolves down from the mountains or bears down earlier than expected that is really causing a threat for people as they're trying to prepare for those colder months? And then lastly, looking at winter. You have the freezing cold. You might need snow drifts. There could be dangerous ice crossings. We ran a campaign in Icewind Dale and it was dreadful. John really ramped up the expectations by having us need cold gear that we had to wear that was weighing us down. It really impacted our carrying capacity. It was actually a lot of fun, but he made it very real for us. The message of this is that your world should change as the seasons pass. Your rivers flood in spring, your crops wither in drought, towns prepare for harsh winters. And another fun tip with this is that you can have it change as your campaign progresses. So if your players return to a village in the winter, that once thriving marketplace is probably half empty now because travel is too dangerous. And that kind of detail makes a world feel really real. Our third element that we are discussing is weather. And again, I feel like this is probably an intuitive thing that a lot of game masters think about, but don't always necessarily have impact their players and making it realistic for them. So if I have a vignette or a description where I'm saying that it's raining, I want to make sure that weather is impacting my gameplay in some way. So let's start with that example. Let's say that I have heavy rain. If there is heavy rain, there's probably a good potentiality that my fires are going to be very difficult to light for my players, or they're not going to light at all. If they're in combat in a heavy rainstorm, those ranged attacks are probably going to suffer a little bit. There might be a -2 or -4 penalty because of limited visibility, or I might even treat it as cover. And if they're traveling through it, that travel is going to slow down. They're going to be moving at a half speed or even quarter speed. Moving on to blizzards, it's going to have some of the same impacts. There's limited visibility in blizzards. My players are probably going to have increased exhaustion as their body works in overdrive to try to stay warm as they're traveling through this. And there is probably going to be some deadly cold. If they're not wearing the right gear, or they are not able to find a place of being warm, hey, they might obtain frostbite. And you know what, Joe? Those fingers are going to have to go, and you're going to need a special spell in order to get them back again. If we are considering sandstorms, these are of course going to disrupt navigation for my players if they're trying to find a particular settlement or a place for shelter in the process. It's going to force them to take shelter because they just can't survive out there in the sandstorm without potentially getting buried, and combat is going to be nearly impossible. If we're looking at a weather situation such as fog, on the other hand, this can be a lot of fun, especially if there is combat. It could hide the enemies, it may muffle the sounds. I'm going to make perception checks a little bit harder as players are moving through it, depending on how thick that fog is. At the end of the day, the environment should demand some sense of adaptation. Players should need the right gear, the right strategies, and the right knowledge in order to survive those weather situations that they're experiencing. What I'm really trying to get at is by having the environment be the backdrop of the game without having any impact on the game can be really boring for players, especially if you're in a situation where players are traveling for an extended period of time through multiple environments with multiple weather effects and different geography, and there's no impact to them. And if you can find creative ways to integrate this into your game, it can be a lot of fun for the players. One of the best examples of this, I think, actually comes out of the old Oregon Trail game, where you have to find a way to cross the river. And you're oftentimes given options. Do you ford the river? Do you cock the wagon and try to cross? Or do you try to find a ferry or another place to cross before going across it? And each one of these has different challenges, different rewards, different costs based on how well you do. And if you can do something similar to that within your game, where there's challenges that they have to overcome or problem solving that has to be done to accomplish a goal in spite of the geography and the environment, that can be a lot of fun for your players, and it ends up being a pretty good story that you're telling together. Wrapping up, let's make sure that you're using your environment as a tool. I hope that you see it that way. If you have enjoyed this series, please hit that like and subscribe button and that little bell. Leave me a comment down below letting me know one of your most memorable environments that you've played or ran a game within. And of course, make sure you go subscribe to our Patreon, where we're regularly putting out resources for game masters like you. We'll talk to you next time.
Dungeon